We're ready to get started now with our Future Strategist Program student presentations. You know, as I noted at the beginning of this conference, the Future Strategist Program, FSP, has really taken off. Started last September, and it's just going like gangbusters, bringing students in and just adding to, taking advantage of the student creativity and understanding and insight that's here and preparing them for careers in national security. We have three quite different TED Talk lights, I guess, on tap. I think you'll be impressed by the insight and perspective they bring. These are the national security thinkers and decision makers of tomorrow, is who you're going to hear from today. No pressure, by the way, guys. So yeah. So you got to bring it. And I know you will, so it'll be no problem. We'll have time for Q&A. They'll do their three presentations, and then we'll do Q&A at the very end of it. So I'll turn it back over to Dr. Tad Schnaufer to moderate the proceedings.
Well, welcome back, everyone. So this is an exciting panel because as we are getting a lot of perspectives from different military, people with military backgrounds, people with industry backgrounds, government, and obviously our think tank and academic backgrounds, here we're being able to get students who have a much different perspective from their field, from being here, living in the time that we have and studying these topics in their undergraduate or graduate degrees. So we're going to kick it off. Each presentation will be roughly 10 minutes. And again, all the questions will happen after all three of our presenters have gone. So we'll begin with the first topic titled Beijing's Strategic Shield, How China Buffers Russia's Military from Western Sanctions, by one of our students, Alex Vu.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Schnaufer. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Vu. I'm a junior right here at USF, double majoring in econometrics and political science. Apart from that, I'm also a research intern with the East-West Center in Washington, D.C., and I'm also a summer 2025 public policy and international affairs fellow at Princeton University. Wow, that's a long title. Sorry about that. All right, so thank you. So today I'll be talking about my work, Beijing as a strategic shield, how China helps buffer Western sanctions against Russia and the Russian military. So can I have the slide, please? Thank you. All right, so, whoa, you probably have to back one. All right, well, thank you. So first, I just want to provide you guys with a sort of a background on what I'm talking today. So of course, as many of you have known, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, a series of sanctions have been imposed by a lot of countries led by the United States against Russia. The goal is obviously to deter Russia from its military endeavor in Ukraine, help cripple the Russian economy, as well as help breaking that defense supply chains to the Russian war machines. Sanctions, we have talked about it many times. You may have heard about it on news articles, on media and all of that. But what are sanctions in particular are? So sanctions comes in many forms. They can either be travel bans against Russian individuals. They can either be asset free. So a lot of assets owned by Russian companies in Western countries or in Western banks are frozen. Increased sanctions on Russia also include arms embargoes. Of course, you don't want to sell weapons to Russia when you're fighting them. Price cap on oil, which is something we'll cover in a couple of minutes. That's very interesting as well. And the ban on dual-use products, most notably semiconductor. So for me, in my opinion, these sanctions pose two biggest problems to Russia and the Russian economy, as well as the Russian military. The first problem is there's no viable form of payment for Russia to finance its war machine. So we have remember back when the war first started, the United States and Western country, we banned Russia against from using the SWIFT system, which is a sort of a global transaction system based in Belgium. It is a big deal because Russia cannot transfer their money from their banks to their to other companies abroad, and it helps disrupting that supply defense chain as well. And it has some limited impacts, I would say, on the ability of the Russian war machine. If you look up here, I have two pictures. One is from, both are from the Lipetsk air base in Russia. The first one is in 2021, and the second one is in 2024. So you can see how a lot of their planes, in terms of the number of the planes, have not increased over time. So that showcases a little bit of evidence for us in terms of how the Russian cannot successfully in supplying their air forces with new planes, albeit it is also because Russia does not rely that much on fighters, but also at the same time there's a limit in their ability to replace planes parts and all of that. So next slide, please. Thank you. So just going more on Russia's response to these sanctions. So of course, the most popular way to bypass these sanctions are through third countries like China, India, and Kazakhstan. Got a couple of graphs here just to point out how important these are. And I feel very interested in India export refining Russian crude oil to Europe. So as we have said, the price cap on Russian oil, which is set by the G7 country at a certain level so that we can disrupt the Russian revenue on oil, but also at the same time not disrupting global supply chain. Well, the problem is that a lot of countries like India, for example, they would buy Russian oil at a much better price, and in turn, they're going to re-export them to Europe. So basically, the money still flow from Europe to Russia. It's just at a much higher price and a much slower rate. At the same time, you can see how at the top right chart, you can see how the flow of goods from the European Union into Russia have been replaced slowly by India and China, and Russia still get their hands on vital parts like semiconductor through countries like Kazakhstan. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I just want to talk more about the role of China in helping Russia buffer from these sanctions. So China, as many people have said, is the main financier of the war in Ukraine. Of course, because assets by Russian-owned billionaires and Russian companies are being frozen in banks in Western countries. So China, of course, slide in with a lot of those loans. And of course, they try to bring the yuan into the big picture because Russia do not have the dollars to buy for their products. So there's this slowly yuanizations of the Russian economy that we have seen with Russia. Now, these pose a couple of problems in their own, especially in June 2024, when the United States, we tried to put secondary sanctions on Chinese companies that work with Russian companies. And we've been achieving this by a lot of reports that showcase that Chinese companies actually defer from doing business with Russians. They have been slowing on their transactions. And so this shows that at a level, these sanctions actually works in terms of deterring China from having business with Russia. And you can see also here, I have a graph that showcases the Chinese export of high priority products. These high priority products are basically dual use, such as high-tech chips, semiconductors, and you have showcased there's been a steadily increase, especially in the number 1 and number 2 in terms of high priority tiers. So these are smaller microchips that are being exported to Russia. We've been seeing an increase in that. Of course, I have a picture of a UAV, of anti-UAV weapons by the Chinese as well. These are non-lethal, but they're showcased that the Chinese definitely trying to supply weapons to the Russians, albeit at a rate that they definitely do not want to poke the United States and Western countries. Now, of course, there are a lot of problems with these yuanizations of the Russian economy, as I mentioned. The biggest problem is slower transaction and higher transaction fees. Transaction fees can be up to 6% to 17%, depends on the date and the time. So that deters Russian companies a lot. At the same time, they're going at a much slower rate. So back in the day, you can finish a transfer at around 2 to 3 days. Now it takes weeks for you to do that. A popular solution to this problem is you're going to take Russian gold, you're going to take them to Hong Kong, sell them, take cash and deposit them in one of the banks in Hong Kong, and then transfer them to China. But these are lengthy as well, and of course the fee are very high. So in terms of sanctions are very much not that useful in terms of stopping these actions entirely, but can they slow them down? Definitely. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I just want to go into the implications and lessons that we learn from how the Chinese and the Russian economy coupling together to bypass Western sanctions. Of course, we are seeing a stronger Sino-Russo relations, especially in terms of military cooperations. A lot of PLA and Russia's military joint exercise have been conducted over the last couple of years. And I would definitely say that these provide valuable experience. There maybe have perhaps the showcase of of Chinese military observance in Ukraine. So these would definitely provide the Chinese with some of that vital military experience that in the case in the future, if they want to go on a military endeavor in Taiwan, for example, they will need them. Russian economies at the same time are risking being dependent upon China. We've seen that. But there's also this risk of overheating. So for the last couple of years, we have seen how the Russian economy, they maintain a development trajectory. Their GDP is still expanding, and Putin still claim that the Russian economy is growing. Well, it is definitely have been growing, but these are thanks to the spending on defense and the military. But once if the war closes, finish really fast, then you run into the risk of overheating, and this is something Putin definitely want to stay away from. And of course, there's some of that idea that there is a no-limits relations between China and Russia. I would have to say that this is not true. We have seen how China responds to secondary sanctions. They definitely still very much care about their relations with the US, especially as there are new tariffs coming up, or with the European market. So this is definitely not a no-limit relations. There are definitely distrust and a sort of a limit between China and Russia. China definitely want to profiteer from the war, but they will not do so at the cost of their relations with European countries and the United States. Something else to consider is the contribution to China's reviving economy. Over the last couple of years, have had recessions, but some may have said that it is because thanks to Russia that they actually get back on track and slow down the impact of that recession. There's, of course, the de-dollarization. We've heard words about the BRICS that want to create a new currency, showcase how China actually want to utilize the war to try to transform them into this global leader in the financial sector. So we'll see more in the future and how that rolls out, and the role of the global south as well, because China has a lot of leverage on them. And we'll see how a lot of the countries such as the UAE, Kazakhstan, the Baltic countries as well have been used to try to navigate these sanctions. So that's pretty much the implications and lessons that I have in mind. So I would definitely want to look more into everybody's lessons and take away from these. But I'll rest my case right here.
Thank you, Alex.
All right, thank you very much.
Have a seat. Yeah. All right. Excellent presentation on sanctions. So let's turn over to our next presentation, the Shahed Blitz, Consequences of Iranian Involvement in the Russian-Ukrainian War by Michael DiLeonardo II. And as a fellow second, I appreciate the challenges, not a junior.
I know my dad does as well, and it's a hard last name. But thank you very much, GNSI Future Strategist Program. I'll keep my introduction brief. I'm International Relations and Intelligence Studies senior here at USF, and I'll just jump right in. So I want to start briefly about why I did this research, the Shahed Blitz, and yes, talking about the consequences of Iranian involvement in the Russo-Ukrainian War. I'm very blessed this semester to have Dr. Mohsen Milani as my professor on Middle East politics. And he gave me this idea to do this research when I was given this opportunity. And I wanted to start with the question, why Russia and Iran? Why do they have that kind of relationship? If you do know a little bit about the history of that region, Russia has invaded Iran actually multiple times throughout its history. Yet now they are geostrategic allies in our perspective. And his answer was actually really simple. As the United States' maximum pressure campaign has grown, as we've put sanctions on Iran and escalated our containment of their regional influence, that's enhanced their relationship with Russia. It's very simple. And there's a proven dynamic there. We've seen it in their cooperation in the Middle East with the Assad regime. And obviously, we're seeing it now with Iran's reactions to Israel and their conflict. So with that historical context, I was like, all right, well, let's dive in and see how has the Russo-Ukrainian War escalated those consequences. So we can go to the next slide. And my first finding was there's been an extensive military technical exchange between the two nations since the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War, particularly in the Shahed drone family that they've provided the Russians. Obviously, that's the title of the research. But also, they've recently provided Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missiles, millions of rounds of ammunition and artillery shells, and on-the-ground, in-theater technical support. There have been Iranian personnel in the Crimean Peninsula and other occupied regions of Ukraine directly helping the Russians with employing these systems and learning how to adapt to Western countermeasures that we've provided them. And I have some examples of what this equipment looks like listed below for your own identification. Obviously, the Russians have their own versions of this kamikaze now. They call it the Garan 2. So if you see that, that's what that means. But what's the Russian payment been? What have they provided back as a result? Well, for now, we know the one I'll highlight is the Su-24 flanker multi-role platform. That is the most advanced multi-role platform that the Iranians have ever operated. Not the most advanced in the world, obviously, but they've never operated a system that advanced, not a fixed-wing platform at least. And they also provided them with R-37M Vimpel beyond visual range air-to-air missiles. These are long-range, highly advanced air-to-air missiles that are comparable to equipment that the United States Air Force operates. Granted, the number might be not be very large, but this does pose a new threat, and this poses a new capability for Iran. Really, though, as we look into future risks, what could Russia begin to provide Iran in the future that presents us with, and the Israelis and our partners in the Middle East, with really more trouble than 24 fixed-wing platforms? And that could be in the form of S-400 air defense systems. So those who are familiar with those are strategic-level air defense assets that the Russians have employed with success in Ukraine and also to some extent in the Middle East. Helping Iran with their long-range missile program, helping Iran with their nuclear program. These have been things we've been worried about for a long time. But as the military technical exchange grows between these nations, these are things that could come in the future. And I also want to highlight real quick on this slide that map of the Caspian region. These shipments of arms take place across the Caspian Sea primarily, and the United States has no ability to interdict those shipments because of the geographic nature of the Caspian Sea. Obviously, it's not connected to the global seaways. So I want to transition to the next slide about the consequences that this has had in Ukraine. And that's primarily in the form of increased Russian long-range strike capability. Very worrying for the Ukrainians, but it should also be worrying for us and for our NATO partners. First, I have a graph provided by the Ukrainian Air Force and some open source data as well of how the Shahed drones fly across Ukraine. As you can see, they're able to hit very deep into Ukraine. They target strategic infrastructure. We've seen videos of these. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the consequences that has had on Ukraine's infrastructure. But what I really wanted to point out is how the occupied territories in Ukraine allow Russia to extend their jump-off point. So they're able to hit deeper into Ukraine the more and more they push within Ukraine. And then to the right, I have a graph provided by the Institute of Science and International Studies observing the interception rates the Ukrainians have had. So obviously very high from 2023 into 2024. The Ukrainians have been able to intercept the Shahed at an average of 80% per the nightly launches. They launch these things every single day at a high rate. But even though you're able to intercept 80% of them, if they launch 70 a night, 30 a night, you're still having damaged assets. You're still seeing a deterioration of infrastructure over time with these salvos. And we'll transition in the next slide with that, because what I really want to focus on, obviously, is the strategic partnership, how it's been enhanced between this. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. Effects for Iran. Number one, this temporarily, at least, balances the relationship between Tehran and Moscow, because priorly, obviously, Russia is the dominant partner in that relationship. They're a larger power. They have more to provide. Iran is not really much compared to them in terms of what they can provide to Moscow. Well, for now, at least during this war, they can. They've increased Russia's long-range strike volume. They've allowed Russia to preserve the domestic stockpiles they have of more advanced cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, which allows them to continuously launch strikes every single day against Ukrainian infrastructure. So as we've provided them with more air defense systems, Russia has more munitions to fire back that are cheaper than the munitions that we fire to intercept. So these Shahed drones cost very, very little compared to what a Patriot interceptor may be, or even the radar systems and the electronic warfare systems we use to counter them. Also, Russia is producing these drones now domestically. They can produce about 80% of the drone on their own. They don't need the Iranians to ship them in all the time, and they can do it at a rate of 6,000 a year. So the JSC Alabuga plant in Russia, the Institute of Science and International Studies has done a lot of good geospatial open source looking at this facility. It's growing, and they are producing at a higher rate than even they expected. There's been some leaked documentation from that facility. As you can see, the red line on that graph is what they expected to be able to produce, and the blue line on that graph is what the Russians have actually been firing over a rate of time. So they are able to produce these drones greater than even they thought that they could originally with just Iranian shipments. And also for the Iranians, an increase in their aerospace capability, obviously, and then the exposure to the lessons that Iran is learning, right? These drones are being tested against U.S. and Western air defense systems every single day in Ukraine. They're being exposed to U.S. electronic warfare systems every single day in Ukraine. Iran is learning from that. Russia is learning from that. And that is if anything, I think that's the biggest takeaway I had on the consequences is Iran's tactical and operational level ability to fight against U.S. forces in the region has increased because Russia took their systems, used it against ours, and that exchange over time, especially with the introduction of AI, and I'm going to get to that at the end here, I think is a grave threat to the United States. But there are some limitations. I'll talk very briefly. One, the two countries do have diverging interests in the Middle East. We tend to not necessarily think that, right? Oh, they both supported Assad together. Well, Russia is very keen on keeping its mutual relationship with Arab states and even Israel, actually, with some warmth. So there's a balancing act from Moscow. The more we support Iran, the more we may anger some partnerships we're trying to develop with states that obviously have diverging opinions on Iran than Russia does publicly, at least. And also the current U.S. administration seeking to isolate Tehran, at least that seems to be where they're heading, but trying to form some kind of détente with Russia. That could put Russia in a position where they may say, hey, let's step back with how much we provide and cooperate with Iran on a military scale in order to stabilize ties with the U.S. So it's a changing process. But as of right now, during the war, Iran's place as a partner to Russia has grown strategically. And then I'll move into my last slide. I only got 2 minutes here because I do want to talk about how these drones have shaped unmanned aerial system doctrine. Pictured here on this slide is the Garan 3. This is a Russian modification. Iranians are doing it as well, where they've upgraded the Shahed drone to have a turbojet engine capability. Right now, they're very slow, right? They're propeller driven. The Ukrainians call them flying mopeds. These are not as slow. These are much faster, which puts us in a bit of a pickle because right now, one of the best ways to counter these systems is with gun-based air defense systems, right? They're slow, they're easy to shoot at. Well, if they're faster, now we have to expend more missile-based capability, right? Particularly thermal-guided air defense munitions that would be really good at picking up on the heat signature from the engine, but that's more expensive. Now we start to lose the cost-effective battle. So over weeks and weeks of these large salvos, that's something that can have an impact. But also, they're using these drones to probe the electromagnetic network in Ukraine. So they're putting sensors on them. They can fly them in, probe the air defense networks, and then come back with software tools, map out the future attack salvos, and do this over weeks. And there's a constant battle between the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Iranians, where they're both modifying their network and modifying the software they use to fight each other in this conflict. We have to be prepared to be adaptable to a very highly intense software and electromagnetic battle that includes these drones. And then last point I want to make in terms of reference to future threats, these drones pose a threat to U.S. forces in the Middle East. There's no doubt about it. If Iran possessed a large fleet of AI-enhanced that can fly autonomously, that can probe our air defense networks beforehand, and over weeks and weeks over time, we could be drained of our capability to intercept them because they're going to have more drones than we have interceptors. So I think that's a threat we need to be worried about, and the cooperation between Iran and Russia has enhanced that threat. I'll end with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. Excellent presentation. Fascinating. All right, we'll kick off our last presentation, keeping on the general theme, apparently, of the axis of upheaval. This one, the quest for cyber hegemony, how China's cyber posture converged with its grand strategy. Yoan?
Yep. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Yoan. I am a graduate student here at USF, and I'm also an Army veteran. I was in the Army for 3 years, and I worked in tech for a number of years before I decided to come back to graduate school. I'll give you a little bit of background as to this particular paper. Originally, it was designed as an extension of John Mearsheimer's theory of regional hegemony. So Mearsheimer, very quickly, he argues that great powers are limited to regional hegemony as opposed to global hegemony because of geography, right? So you have bodies of water, mountains that prevent a great power from becoming a global hegemon. Well, my extension of his theory is that in cyber, there are no geographical barriers. So there's nothing that prevents a great power from becoming a cyber hegemon. So that's just a little bit of background, and then I'll obviously tie it into the Russo-Ukrainian War. Next slide, please. Okay, so what we'll discuss today is the pre- and post-2008 grand strategy of China. We will take a look at how the grand strategy or the cyber posture converged with the grand strategy. We'll also discuss some case studies that highlight why this is the case, at least according to my research. And then we'll tie it to Russian behavior pre-2022, but also post-war as the war started, right? So we'll tie it in. We will discuss what Ukraine did about Russian cyber attacks and some of the lessons that can be taken from it. Next slide. Okay, so pre-2008, if you look at the CCP Congress documents and speeches by Hu Jintao and others, there's a lot of talk of a peaceful rise, active reassurance, win-win cooperation. So it's a defensive posture in terms of the PRC, right? The grand strategy of the PRC. Post 2008, it's a lot more aggressive. So if you review the speeches of Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, they're talking about war-forward diplomacy, dealing with global volatility. So if you remember 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis, China saw an opportunity. It saw a decadent, quote unquote, decadent West that was undergoing economic difficulties. And it also coincided with its quite large economic rise. So as China's economy was getting better, the West's economy was declining. And you also see talk of international military competition. So the PLA begins to ramp up its capabilities. Now, in terms of the cyber posture, this is interesting because pre-2008, I'm going to date myself a little bit, but I was actually an undergraduate studying cybersecurity at the time. And cyber attacks were a thing. Malware was a thing. And yet, if you look at the PRC strategy document and speeches, there's no mention of cyber. They generally talk about increasing their technology capabilities, but they keep it very general, right? Contrast that with post-2008. If you look at CCP Congress documents, they directly, specifically talk about countering US dominance, building up their cyber capabilities, and we begin to see PRC offensive cyber operations after this time period. Okay, so before I talk about specific cyber operations by the PRC, I'm going to specify a caveat, right? It is very difficult in cyber to definitively attribute a cyber attack to a particular actor. You can jump from machine to machine. You can use VPNs and other sophisticated masquerading techniques to hide where the attack is coming from, right? So just be aware of that. However, cybersecurity experts, there's a consensus in the cybersecurity community in terms of these cyber attacks that can be attributed to the PRC. So starting in 2013, we have the attack against the Office of Personnel Management. So Office of Personnel Management, they had the records of millions of potential federal government employees, people who had applied to work in various agencies, including fingerprints. So the PRC or groups associated with it, they went into the OPM and stole these records. 2017, the US and South Korea, they come to an agreement on deploying the THAAD missile system to South Korea. Chinese are very unhappy about this. They decide to hack the Ministry of Defense as well as Lati Group, which is a South Korean conglomerate, because that conglomerate had leased land to the US and the South Korean military for the purpose of deploying the THAAD missiles. 2020, there was a very prominent attack against Taiwan called the Cold Lock ransomware attack. And what they did was they infected Taiwanese systems, the systems of a Taiwanese oil company, state-owned oil company, and they infected them with ransomware. Ransomware is basically malware that encrypts systems, prevents legitimate users from being able to access them until a ransom is paid to the actor who encrypted the systems. So they did this. This had real-world implications. So users of gas stations, they would show up to the gas station, try to pump gas. They were not able to pay for the gas. So real-world implications there. Next slide, please. Okay, so tying it into the theme of the conference. So pre-2022, so from 2014 to 2022, as the last panel discussed, really the war began in 2014, we see a number of Russian cyber attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure. And starting with the 2014 attack against the Electoral Commission, where they tried to change the vote tallies on the parliamentary elections in Ukraine. 2015, 2016, we also see attacks against the Kyiv power grid. So power grid went offline for a period of time. And we also see Ukraine's response to that is that they begin hardening their system. So what is hardening? Hardening is you have a computer server, say, right? That server has open avenues of communication where legitimate users can connect to it for administration, managing databases, et cetera. Well, if you're a malicious actor, you can also do the same thing and penetrate the system. So hardening means that you are, in effect, closing those avenues of communication, restricting them, so that a malicious actor is unable to attack that system, right? So Ukraine started doing that. They also started real-time monitoring, or better real-time monitoring of their IT infrastructure, and they started designating incident response teams. So this is both the monitoring capabilities and the incident response teams are vital to the extent that you need to be able to detect that an attack is happening, but you also need trained cybersecurity professionals who are able to respond to the attack, right? So Ukraine started doing this with help from US Cyber Command. So they weren't doing this on their own. Okay, fast forward to February 2022, we see the disruption of Viasat satellites. So the Ukrainian government and military relied on these systems for communication purposes, and the Ukrainians quickly adapted. They started using Starlink terminals for their military communication, as we all know, right? Also very interesting, the response to this was the stand-up of the Ukraine IT Army. So 185,000 civilians who were trained in cybersecurity. They rushed to aid the Ukrainian government in trying to counter these Russian cyber attacks. Okay, lastly, a very interesting case is the malware that was sent to Ukrainian recruits. So potential recruits into the Ukrainian army received a link. They would click on the link, it would take them to the Android Play Store, and they would download an app. And the app would give them misinformation. So they would tell them the wrong address for the recruiting station, or it would tell them not to report. Google actually quickly identified this vector, and it was able to remove the application from the App Store. Okay, next slide. All right, so to wrap things up, the big takeaway I would like you to take away from this presentation is that China and Russia are employing very similar cyber strategies in terms of what I mentioned before, attempting to be cyber hegemons. The Ukrainians, as small as the country is, have been successful, with help, but they have been successful at countering these attacks. So maybe not the US, but perhaps including the US, certainly minor powers like Taiwan, they would do well to take a look at these lessons, take a look at how the Ukrainians have been able to counteract these attacks. In case there is a future conflict with the PRC, they would be in a better position to basically deny the PRC these avenues of attack. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, some excellent presentations from our fabulous students here at USF. So we've covered some broad topics: sanctions, drones, and then cyber security and cyber attacks. So obviously, again, you can have your questions for the students either through the app or through the note cards on your table. You can write them out and we'll bring them up here. But we have a couple coming in already. First one, back to you, Yoan, for the cyber, right? Cyber, like you mentioned, doesn't have oceans, it doesn't have mountains, it's not really geographically bound. But what about some other possible barriers such as languages, cultures, and then just software capabilities? How does that affect that cyber attack or cyber landscape?
All right, that's actually a great question. The language of the internet, the language of cyber, language attack is English. There's a famous developer of operating systems called Linus Torvalds. He developed the Linux operating system. I don't know if any of you are familiar. And to him, somebody asked him a question, something to the effect of, why didn't you write the comment in your code in Finnish? He's Finnish. And he said, I never even thought about it, right? Like it was natural. Not only are programming languages designed to be written in an English-like code, but the language of most technologists is English. They're all able to communicate in the language, right? So I suspect, I know the Chinese and the Russians, even though they have Cyrillic, they have Chinese characters, they all communicate in English. They are able to learn the same programming languages that everybody else in the world knows. So from that perspective, I don't see much variation in terms of culture and language affecting cyber attacks in the future.
Okay, excellent. And we can go back to the panel slide for the slide behind us. And then for next question, can military technological exchanges serve as a mechanism to circumvent economic sanctions by replacing traditional money transactions with direct bartering of goods, even in-kind transactions, if you will? So that's for both you, Michael, and Alex. So can that tech military coordination between Russia and China be used to circumvent sanctions?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's a very interesting question because they definitely have the technological capabilities. So we have seen how when the Russian got shut off from the SWIFT system, they actually created two systems, two similar system that can incorporate Russian banks into their own payment system and so make that transfer a lot better. But at the same time, these systems are not as well-functioned as the system that we have here in the West. So in terms of capability, they definitely have the capability to build such systems to help navigate sanctions and utilize these technology as a sort of way to evade. But of course, at the same time, you have to spend a lot of time and money to build these systems and keep them running as well. And these sanctions are not immune to attacks from groups here in the West. So at the same time, we can target them and we can try to bring them down. So the problem here is not necessarily a problem in terms of technology. It's in terms of the cost. Will that cost of building this system and maintaining them outlast the war itself, or would it be sufficient enough for this transaction to take place? Sometimes we're probably going to be faster and easier to just grab a gold, went to Hong Kong and sell it and take the cash and deposit them. So there are ways, and of course, in terms of cost, we can never know the details because these are hidden numbers.
Well, in terms of Western technology and drone development, any play on that with the Iranian-Russian scope?
I think to Iran, it most certainly is a way to strategically avert those sanctions, because the cost of or the gain in knowledge of how to employ these systems against Western air defense systems, Western electronic warfare systems is more valuable to Iran than I think dollars. And I think to the Russians right now, having the capability to produce 6,000 Shahed drones a year is more valuable to Moscow and its war effort against Ukraine than raw dollars from Iran. So to me, it just depends on, and he makes great points, but what do you value? Do you value Iran's ability to strategically threaten U.S. forces in the Middle East by having advanced, autonomous, guided, turbojet-powered, cheap Shahed drones? Or do they care more about raw dollars to their economy? I would argue right now for the Iranian regime that they seem to care more about their military capability, but that's not for me to judge, obviously.
Well, certainly the regime stability would be one of their priorities, as long as that's not threatened.
Dr. Milani would agree with you as well.
Right, yeah. Absolutely. So we see this current thread about sanctions and how other powers can get around sanctions, whether if it's military, technological, or even in the cyber realm. Do we see sanctions as having the bite that they're intended, or are they too easily circumvented, whether we're looking at using other nations, other flag ships to go around oil shipments, or that the Russians, for example, they border Iran and China, so the sanctions just can't really take hold, or in the cyberspace, again, there's really no boundaries other than firewalls and things. How do sanctions play out, and do they have the bite that they intend to have? And we'll start back with Alex.
Thank you, Dr. Schnaufer. I mean, I think it depends a lot on the definition of the bite that you mentioned here. What's the strategic? Painful, yeah, but how much pain? Is it painful enough to stop the invasion? Because you can say.
No, I was gonna say no. Well, it's obviously each sanction in theory would have a goal, just like you don't use military forces without some sort of political objective. In theory, they would implement a sanction with some sort of goal. But have we seen the goals of the sanctions, let's say on Russia? Has it limited its economy? Has it limited its ability to conduct the conflict in the way that it wants to?
Well, I definitely have to say that the sanctions have worked to a certain level in limiting the Russian military-industrial complex, as well as making Russia worse in Ukraine a lot harder. I want to point back into how this ban on dual-use technology and high-tech materials into Russia have severely affected their ability in Ukraine. So one of the things that we banned the most in terms of stuff exporting to Russia is semiconductor chips. High-tech chips that we're using now in the West or at 5 nanometer, and we actually have companies that can make them up into 2 and 3 nanometers. The Russians cannot get their hands on any of those because they're sold and created here in the West. So what they would do is they would turn to Chinese companies, but Chinese companies' chips are less reliable, slower, and they are much bigger. So the Russian actually have to change a lot of of their military systems into using much bigger chips or at 65 nanometers. And let me tell you, 65 nanometers is really big. We've been using them, the last time we used them here in the West, since 2005. So that's 20 years old technology. We don't use that anymore. And the Russian definitely cannot use these high-tech weapons. So I would definitely have to say that the sanction works to a certain level. And at the same time, of course, it's not the only reason. But at the same time, the Russians have been resorted into this sort of attritional warfare strategy in the war in Ukraine instead of trying to go for a knockout punch. And I definitely think that these sanctions plays a role into that. Now, how big is it? It's very hard to tell because we don't have the sufficient data. And of course, at a strategic level, it does not stop Russia's idea of continuing the war. But to a certain extent, it definitely makes life a lot harder for Russia and the Russians' economy. And as you mentioned, they need to be combined with other measures. As you put sanctions on Russia, you need to combine them with providing more and better arms to the Ukrainians. We've seen this in 2023, how we imposed sanctions on Russia, but we didn't send the Ukrainians the weapons that we're requesting. I would make the case that if we send them the weapons that they were asking at that time, we probably would have had a much better stance on the battlefield right now.
Interesting. So on drones?
I just want to push back on that just a little bit. I agree with you. However, in my research, I found that in these Shahed drones that Iran has and in the Quran ones they're producing, they have a level of Western technology in them. They're using Western components. So somehow, some way, they're circumventing these sanctions by through some kind of third party, and maybe you two could look into that more. It's not for me to decide. But somehow they have Western components in these drones that are blowing up all across Ukraine and in the Middle East. So somehow they're getting them. They may not be able to produce them, the chips that they need, but they're getting them somehow.
No, that's true. In one of my slides, there's the part that there's this graph about Kazakhstan's imports of semiconductor from European countries and re-exporting them to Russia. So definitely, they somehow still find a way to get there from Western countries to them. They just cannot, produce them, but they still can be able to sell them. And it's impossible for us to just stop the sale of semiconductor into any of these countries. It would be really hard. So that is a conundrum.
What about in cyberspace? Do sanctions have any play there?
Sure. So this isn't particularly my area of research. However, there is a very fine line between cyber attacks and cybercrime. In many cases, these actors are using cybercrime to finance state actions. For example, North Korea is notorious for having entire floors full of people who are dedicated to spreading ransomware across the globe, and then receiving payment in crypto, which is untraceable. So although I have not specifically run into research specifically on Russia, I suspect that the Russians are also carrying out similar operations to finance various aspects of the war in Ukraine. So from that perspective, it is, I think, maybe not trivial, but relatively easy to bypass sanctions using cybercrime and using crypto.
Excellent. One of the other questions from the audience going to you, Michael. Given Iranian setbacks of the last 18 months or so with the conflict in the Middle East, has that hindered their ability to support the Russians, and how has that affected the relationship between them and the Russians in terms of this drone exchange?
So two things. One, I spoke to Dr. Milani at length about the collapse of the Assad regime and how that's impacted their relationship. Obviously, that's a loss of strategic self-interest. So one thing he points out a lot, and I also believe, being aligned against the Western world order is not necessarily a concrete self-interest that can drive real policy. There needs to be more, whether it's economic or whether it's military exchange. And so the loss of the Assad regime and that kind of thing that tied the two nations together, that being gone certainly loses some influence for Iran in their relationship and balances it towards Moscow. But I would argue that the damage has kind of already been done. The Russians can produce these drones on their own, as I mentioned, and the Iranians have already gained useful insights on how to employ them against Western air defense systems. And I think the growth of autonomous warfare, General McKenzie gave a great brief in his keynote yesterday about the threat of highly autonomous platforms. I mean, just imagine Iran with a greater, they have more of these, they're faster, and they can think on their own. And they already know, and they've already gained electromagnetic data and software data on how to use them against our air defense networks, everything that we employ, almost, and future systems as well. That to me, that damage is already done. And Russia can produce them now as well on their own.
Okay, and very interesting. So to wrap up, I'll give each of you one sentence for your major lesson takeaway from your presentation. So if you condense all those thoughts into one sentence for our a possible policymaker. Alex, it seems you're ready.
In my case, I would say the word that I'll choose is breakable. So the Russian and the Chinese alliance is not unbreakable. They are very breakable. We have seen how the Chinese at the same time is trying to profiteering of Russia's invasions of Ukraine, but they do it at a limited level to ensure that they themselves are not affected by Western sanctions. So it is not a perfect alliance in many ways, as Michael mentioned. Just because that they are both against the United States doesn't mean it's a perfect idea for an alliance. They are breakable, and with the right strategy and with the right motives, that we can actually hit the points that hurts most between Beijing and Moscow and try to separate them, which I believe is crucial in the upcoming years, and especially as we try to close the war in Ukraine.
I believe that was a run-on sentence, but we'll let it slide.
Sorry about that.
Michael?
Second language.
That applies to, that's a good point though. It applies to Iran and Russia as well. I would just say, I think that our generation can't be the generation that underestimates any adversary that's against the United States and our partners. Iran and Russia are capable of developing systems that can surprise us and do extreme damage. And we are best to overestimate that ability than to underestimate it.
Very good. Go on.
Ukraine is a small country that has been able to do a lot with their cyber capabilities. Learn from what the Ukrainians have done going forward.
Excellent. Well, let's thank our students for their excellent presentations and responding to your questions. Thank you guys so much. Alex, Michael, Yoan.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.